Hi, I'm Walter, and welcome back to the helicopter lesson in 15 minutes or less. Today, in this session, we're going to address systems, both oil and fuel. And of course, we'll have many sessions after that talking about other parts of the helicopter itself. But systems, right? We have multiple different systems in a helicopter that have to work in unison in order to be able to give you a safe aircraft to fly. And that's something that we need to take into account every time we go out and do a pre-flight check. And I've said it before in other episodes, but I cannot over emphasize that even before you touch the aircraft, you want to observe it from the outside standing back. For example, we talked about oil. We want to observe if there's any spots of oil in unusual places or any kind of fluids laying underneath the aircraft itself. And it's important that if you have an oil tray below it with a blue chuck, replace the chuck from time to time, on a regular basis, so you can see if there's any spillage coming from an unusual place, like if there's a seal leaking that would drip into a different location normally speaking. So again, your visual inspection from afar is critically important. Now, the more complex the helicopter, the more complex the systems, of course, but we're going to keep it here to the R22 and R44. So in the oil system itself, we really have to first understand that oil has a job to do, right? And that's part of the reason why it is something that is almost like the lifeline, right? It is that besides fuel that gives you the oxygen, in other words, it gives you the power to drive, the oil keeps everything moving, right? It seals things, it cools things, it protects things, it lubricates things, and then it also cleans. And all that goes through a cycle and always going to a filtration system where the dirt gets caught, and that's part of the reason why we have a 50 or 100 hour oil change, and we have to add oil to the system on a regular basis. So what kind of oil are we using here? We have an acid disbursement, which cleans very well, and a mineral oil. And there's some different types that you can use, but generally speaking, we're using 15W50. And what do the numbers stand for? The first 15 speaks to the viscosity during cold conditions, and the 50 is the viscosity during hot conditions. That's general standard, and again, part of flying is to inspect to see what the level of oil is, what is the condition of the oil, not just go by the 100-hour oil changes, but also look at it, closely inspect it. And of course the quantity. So the quantity, generally speaking, is 4 to 6 quarts, max of 9 quarts. And you have to look at your very specific pilot operating handbook, what is right for your particular aircraft that you fly. Now you don't want to go below 4 or 7 in order to prevent any kind of issues. And again, no oil or less oil than needed. Your seals, your cooling, your protection is all disintegrated to a point that it actually could cause, potentially speaking, overheating of the engine or even locking it up. So it is important. Now, one thing you do need to take into consideration is that you can overfill it, right? You can pour too much into it, but the engine has a way to get rid of that, right? Always go back to its normal baseline. And between aircraft, over time, these engines find their own level that they like to be at. So again, over time you will learn what that is for the aircraft that you fly. Now, when to measure oil? Do you do it as soon as the flight is over with, and you do it, to see when the temperature is still very hot? The guideline is that you want to wait about 10 minutes after the engine has been running for oil to return to the sump. In other words, it has gone through full circulation and then come to a sensor. So it's not super hot and not cold either, in order to get the most accurate assessment. But again, word of caution, you better have too much than not enough, right? If you have too much, the aircraft will find a way to get rid of it. So the oil system itself, again, the best thing to do here is to find a mechanic and look at this together by have him or her point the finger or where the pieces of the puzzle are. And some of it you can see, some of it you can see, some of it is external, attached to the engine compartment, and other things are integrated into the engine. So if you happen to have an engine out for demonstration purposes, go look at that, because it kind of makes sense that where's the oil flow in order to be able to find, provide that lubricant, that and cooling the engine itself. Because, do we mix fuel and oil in the cylinders, all that stuff? If you're not mechanical, it really doesn't make a whole lot of sense, right? So the oil pathway, it starts in the pump and it goes to the oil filter. By the bimetallic switch tests temp of the oil and skips if it is cool enough, right? If it is too hot, it goes to the oil cooler. And these are the aluminum fins that pull the heat from the oil, and the air cooling vent cools the fins itself. It's no different as on the back of your refrigerator, or if you look at the fins on the cylinders on a motorcycle, the principle is very much the same, right? That heat is dissipated by having cool air coming across it. Because as we are flying, cool air is forced through the system itself by grabbing outside air and cooling it down. So after it's cooled, it is sent to the engine galley. The oil is pre-pressurized and splashed cooled, and the oil lines fall from the cylinder heads to the sump again, low pressure line. And then blow-by tube excretes the excess oil out of that's where I said, again, the engine will find the right amount of oil it needs to have. That's how it gets rid of it if it is not needed, right? If it is causing a pressure differential on the engine itself. So we have a wet sump, right? The oil is carried in the sump that is an integral part of the engine itself. Or we have a dry sump. Oil is contained in a separate tank and is circulated through the engine by the use of pumps. Again, go to the Pilot Operating Handbook and find out if your aircraft is wet sump or a dry sump system itself. All right, again, oil is critical, but not as critical as having fuel, right? No fuel, no flying, but both of them is something you need to be obviously know and understand the basics around. So fuel systems in the 22 and the 44 are both gravity fed, meaning that their tanks are sitting elevated, right? They're sitting behind the left and right seat and a little over our shoulders. It contains, in the fuel tanks, there are bladders, and they were put into place not initially when it was designed, but put into place after the fact when they, through studies and grumble zones and accidents, they are preventing, potentially speaking, a rupture and kind of fuel spillage can lead to, of course, a fire, which is an event that you don't want to have happen under any circumstances itself. So it's gravity fed. It contains the shut-off valve is behind the left seat, the gasolator, and the tank air vent is inside the mast fairing itself. So again, it needs to vent air in order to be able to not get locked, a vapor lock in place, right? So it needs to be sure that it's open, and it will be inspected by the mechanic on a regular basis. The gasolator filter collects debris from the fuel itself. And again, your role is to inspect the fuel for not just is it that tinge blue for 100 low lead, but also looking for any kind of particles and certainly looking for water, right? And again, the best time, if you see something, say something, and you're better off not flying and going up and finding out that the fuel is contaminated, right? There's been more than one of accidents where contamination was the root cause, and that is somewhat preventable itself. Again, a good pre-flight inspection will help you in that manner. So the drains are designed to check for water and sediment and fuel quality. The fuel gauge is electrically operated on a float type transmitter. Now, again, don't put all the trust in the world in just the fuel gauges. It is important to eyeball it. Now, in a helicopter, we don't tend to measure how much fuel it is, but it is important as you step up to look at the rotor head and mast, open up the fuel tanks and take a look if there's actually fuel in there, that you can see it. Right? Most of the time, we try to have near full tanks, so you should be able to see the level. Make sure that the cap gets screwed on well, so A, for venting purposes, so we don't get air trapped, right, and vapor lock, but also that we don't allow any contaminants to go into itself. There is a system in place when there is low fuel that a warning light comes on onto your dashboard, which tells you you have about a gallon left or less than 10 minutes of flight. Now, I wouldn't test that. If the light comes on, I would land as soon as practically possible. Right? You're much better off landing it next to a road somewhere and have somebody bring over 5 or 10 gallons of fuel than almost made it back and you end up going into an auto rotation because of fuel starvation. Right? So the auxiliary tank on the opposite side, of course, is interconnected with the main tank. So one valve controls from both tanks. So if you go sitting between the left seat and the right seat, you'll see a fuel valve on and off. It's a red valve that is there. Make sure you inspect it. Again, it's on your checklist of something you need to look at before going to the next step. Right? Without fuel, we're not going to go very far. The auxiliary is slightly above the main, so it drains down. So again, it's also slightly smaller than the main tank itself. So from a visual perspective, this is for the 22. The capacity is about 18.3 gallons. Auxiliary is 9.7 gallons for a total combined of 28 gallons. Now, again, usable is 26.3. Like anything else in the world, you want to put a safety margin in it for you. And the safety margin means that instead of calculating that I have 26.3 usable for my flight, listen, round it off to 22.5 or 25. Don't again, if you have tighter margins, then you'll make it the right decision to get some fuel on a long cross country rather than pushing it to the limit itself, right? The unusual fuel, and that's something a typical question you will get, right? It's about a gallon total. It's near at the bottom to allow somewhere for the dirt and water to settle down, and assumes clean fuel is at the top. Again, this is something that will be inspected during the 100-hour inspection, but you too, during your draining of, looking at the fuel quality, is something that you will be looking at, and of course reporting back on. And we have three ports. We have two inside the engine cowling, and one is going to be underneath the aircraft for you to check to make sure. Again, as the fuel valve is off on the inside, you should not be getting any fuel coming out of those lines. And it's not something you can inspect for yourself. All right, for the 44, we now not only have the left seat, right seat, we have a passenger left and right. We have the auxiliary fuel tank is on the right side, so that's behind the pick, and the main tank is on the left side. And with the intention, if the pilot is sitting on the right side, normally speaking, that the weight is more equally distributed between the left and the right itself. Again, it depends on how much fuel that you carry for that particular flight, which might be adjusted. Depends on total useful load that is left in the aircraft. Right? You might have to get less fuel in order to reduce the total weight itself. Again, the main tank is 30.5, auxiliary is 17.2 for a total of 47.7 gallons, of which the usable, again, take a certain number off that. Right? So don't calculate for yourself it is 43 or 44. Give yourself that margin of error so you don't have to worry about it. Again, generally speaking, you'd burn about 15 gallons per hour. So the capacity is 3 hours and 25 minutes with a 25-minute reserve, which meets minimum standards, but that is something you should never push, right? You should plan around that. A couple other things. Again, the low fuel light in the aircraft, you can test by pushing the little button in the back of the engine cowling to test to see what it looks like, that you have a visual connection to that, and understand what it is that you need, right? Land, as soon as possible, immediately, without having to go into an auto rotation. Of course, you're already out without fuel, then it becomes an emergency, and you have to do an emergency landing using an auto rotation. The bladders that are now in all of the Robinson helicopters that have been past X number of years, and they will be, and it's just for pure safety purpose, right? The fuel travel is that the tank vents allow the air to replace the fuel once it's drained out, right? So that stops a vacuum from happening that sucks the fuel down, and it's located in the rotor mast. We cannot inspect it, but it is inspected by the mechanic in their 100-hour inspection itself. All right, when it comes down to fuel grades, we should make it a point that you get the fuel that is designed, or one grade up, never a grade lower, right? That's a general. But the right thing to do is to get the right grade, right? At 100 low lead, that's designed for these engines. That's what you want. So it is indicated in the aircraft, in the pilot operating handbook. It is something that will be drilled into you on a continuous basis. But it is something that you have to be aware of. and be very conscious about. Now, today, most of the time, you'll have two options at most of the fuel farms that you go to. You have either a Honda Lowlat, or you have jet, which is like kerosene, which would not do well inside of our fuel injected or carbureted engines that require a Honda Lowlat. So just be very, very, very conscious about that. Again, if you do happen to use a low-grade improper fuel, this can cause that detonation, right? That uncontrolled spontaneous explosion of the mixture in the cylinder itself. Some potential for pre-ignition, right? That is when you have a spark plug that is fouled, you have a little burning ember that's inside. Again, these things should not happen because we selected the wrong fuel. Right? It is not. Now, be mindful the mount of the tank itself is not like you go to the gas station, you cannot put diesel in it because the filling handle is larger diameter that does not fill in a gasoline tank. The helicopter doesn't have that, right? It's wide enough to fit both, so it takes you to put some thought about that in order to prevent that from that taking place, which can of course be detrimental. All right, that is it for the oil and fuel system. Thank you again for joining. Again, I cannot overemphasize, do a good pre-flight inspection, spend some quality time with your mechanic, not once, but do it 2 or 3 times so it really sinks in. Keep talking about these things. Stay safe, right? Always carry enough fuel with you because you want to live with any kind of regret. I'll see you soon again. Thank you.